Giagiv, Erfanagas Falcha, Gorav Maguv, Oslave, Ansha Armajan. Hello, everyone, and welcome. So glad you could be here with us this morning. I'm Bill O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the board of directors here at Gaelic Park, for those of you who don't know me. And on behalf of my fellow directors and all our members, our staff, our volunteers, the entire Gaelic Park community, we want to thank the Irish government for choosing Chicago for the 25th International Famine Commemoration. Appreciate that. And to welcome Minister Patrick O'Donovan, proud Limerick man. We're pleased to host this solemn remembrance here at Chicago Gaelic Park. And it's great to have Ireland's Minister for Sport here at the home of the Chicago GAA. Consul General Brian Cahalan, Vice Consul Padraig Manning, their entire staff at the Irish Consulate, they've been a pleasure to work with as we prepared for today. The Chicago Consulate has always been a great friend and partner to Gaelic Park. We appreciate their support, and we thank them for that. We want to offer special welcomes to MWRD Vice President Theresa Flynn and to Father Anthony Brankin. Theresa is a local county government official, and she's someone who grew up Gaelic. That means she's part of our community here from a very, very young age. Still young, right, Theresa? Father Brankin's a lifelong Southsider, product of St. Rita Parish, and he's the designer and sculptor of this moving memorial for An Gartamór, the Great Hunger. If you're wondering about Father's art studio, what kind of art studio does the priest have? This masterpiece was created in the garage at St. Thomas More. So, colonial Ireland in the mid-19th century, the immense tragic suffering of Irish people, our ancestors, events that shaped Ireland and beyond, one of the reasons that many of us live here today, we must always remember. I'd like to invite Consul General Brian Cahalan up to move things along. Hello, Brian.
Thank you very much, Bill. And on behalf of my colleagues, Padraig Manning and Christina Lizakakis, who are here with us today, and Minister O'Donovan and his delegation, I just wish to welcome everyone here and thank them for joining us this morning. I also wish to thank Bill and Mary O'Sullivan and all the team here, Michael Bennett, all the team here at Gaelic Park for the wonderful preparation they have put in for this event this morning. I also wish to welcome Father Brankin and thank him for joining us today. I now call on Vice President of the Metropolitan Water Board, the Honourable Theresa Flynn, to join us, as Bill says, well known here in Gaelic Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, and thank you, Brian. Today, as we gather here at Chicago Gaelic Park to lay this wreath, we remember the journey that begins in sorrow but grew into strength. When we look at the skyline of Chicago today, its towers of glass and steel, it's easy to forget the great city that first rose from the sweat, the strength, and the hope of working hands. Long before there were skyscrapers, there were shovels, and behind those shovels were the Irish. In the mid-1800s, the waves of Irish immigrants fled a homeland devastated by inflicted famine and imposed hardships. They crossed the Atlantic not in search of comfort, but of survival, and they brought with them a relentless will to work. When they arrived in Chicago, they found a city still young, muddy, and full of potential. What they lacked in wealth, they made up for in labor, the very labor that would build Chicago from the ground up. One of the greatest testaments to their efforts stands in the story of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. Completed in 1900, it was an engineering marvel, reversing the flow of the Chicago River, protecting the city from diseases like cholera and typhoid, and opening new pathways for trade. But while the city celebrated the achievement, it was the Irish laborers, men with more than just calloused hands and tired backs, who dug that canal. Many lived in rough canal camps, facing dangerous working conditions for very little pay. and many are buried just a few miles from here at the St. James Calsag Cemetery. And once you walk in, you'll see a grave marked for the Flanagan family, who are from Carlingford County, Louth, and the next one from Cork, and the next from Meath. Their grit transformed both the city's landscape and its future. As those workers and their Irish families settled here, their fight did not end with the day's labor. The Irish were among the first to organize and demand fair treatment for working men and women. They helped shape Chicago's labor movement, standing shoulder to shoulder in the fight for not only better wages, safer conditions, and dignity of work, not just for Chicago, but for all of the nation. As Vice President of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, I am deeply proud to serve in a public health agency that stands upon the very foundations those Irish laborers built. The canals they dug and the waterways they shaped gave birth to an organization devoted to protecting the health and environment of all of Cook County, serving over 5 million, and including 129 municipalities and all 50 Chicago wards. That legacy continues today, with many Irish and Irish Americans not only serving in labor, but in leadership roles. Our civil engineers, our electrical engineers, our scientists, lawyers, our past executive directors, and our current acting executive director. So just to give you a taste of the few names that are out there, we have the O'Briens, the Farnans, the Kennedys, the Fitzpatricks, the Murrays, the O'Connors, Cassans, Conway, Durkin, and Perkovich, which counts because his mother was from Mayo. Today, as we lay this wreath, we remember the famine that drove them from their homes and honor the courage that carried them here. On a recent trip to Ireland, we visited one of the most beautiful places I have ever been, and it's not Ballyhaig. It was Achill Island. Seeing the deserted famine village of more than 80 homes, the ruins back in Kiel, and reading the placards along the way was a sobering silence. Their story lives on, not in just the canals and bridges they built, but in the very spirit of Chicago, a city that values toughness, community, and resilience. The Irish came to escape hunger, but they built a city that would feed the dreams of millions. Our presence in Chicago Gaelic Park is testimony to our strength. For near 40 years, we held our Irish Fest here in the worst and best of monsoon rains, fine days, scorching heat, all on the backs of our volunteers. The shovels, both literally and figuratively, were put in the ground here by Irish men and women made of the same grit. It is historical fact that in 1997, British Prime Minister Tony Blair acknowledged the lack of action taken by Britain in a form of an apology. He mentioned it leaving deep scars. Scars fade, but never completely go away. It is up to us to keep this somber history alive and always at the surface in this famine commemoration. Thank you so very much for inviting me to share in today's memorial.
Thank you very much, Vice President Flynn. It's now my privilege to call on Ireland's Minister for Sport, Communications and Culture, Patrick O'Donovan TD, to speak. Thank you.
Gur míle maithagibh go léir agus dús ba bhaile mo bhuíochas a gháil de gach duine anseo I Chicago. Asocht an fáilte chur sibh Róm agus asocht an ócáid speisialta sin ina bhfuil míad le chéile chun comóra a dhéanamh an gorta mhór in Éireann. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, can I say thanks very much to everybody here in Gaelic Park. This is not my first time here. I was here before in a personal capacity, and I was here before in a official capacity as well, as minister when I had responsibility in the Department of Finance for the St. Patrick's Day Parade when I was here last. And for me it's a bit like a homecoming because I have a lot of family here in Chicago. I'm not sure whether some of them made it here this morning yet, or whether the alarm clocks didn't go off, but a bit like myself. Chicago was a home and is a home to my extended family. My uncles and my mother immigrated here in the 1950s and 60s. My mother thankfully went back because my father wouldn't come out here. Had she not, I probably would be the local assemblyman for the south side. But anyway, I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank everybody who has been involved in the commemoration here this morning. And more importantly, I want to thank everybody who has been involved in the creation of a safe space for Irish culture, games, music, tradition, and sport here in Gaelic Park. This is an amazing place. I was here before, and I know it gets support from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I should into the future, because this really is a sanctuary for those people in this great city who call themselves Irish, and it's a beautiful place. I'm also delighted to be here today. I'm very proud to be here as a minister in cabinet in a sovereign, independent Irish government, which, when this terrible event happened in Ireland and really culminated in 1847, in Black 47, was something that the Irish at the time could only dream of. Daniel O'Connell, a person who I have hold in great esteem, and somebody who I view as my kind of political mentor. I'm going to be taken out by my own flag. Dedicated his life to the service of people, to try and get self-determination for the Irish without using any sorts of force, and did so purely in the spirit of the United Irishmen, of the Catholic, Protestant and dissenter, that Irish people should be able to determine their own future and for their own future. So as a minister in an independent Irish sovereign government, I'm very conscious of the people who went before me, who ploughed a very lonely furrow, who didn't achieve what I can now celebrate, being a member of an Irish government, and an Irish government in a totally different context to the one that Daniel O'Connell spoke about in his last speech to the House of Commons in 1847, where as Member of Parliament he warned the British establishment at the time that if they didn't do something about the devastating problem that was emerging in Ireland, that 1/4 of the population would perish, and that's exactly what happened. 1 million died, and 1 million were forced to immigrate. And of course those figures continued to rise, so much so that the population of the island of Ireland fell from 8 million to just over 2 million. And if this was to happen today in a modern context, there would be something of a global outrage, and some of the main protagonists would be brought to The Hague to face the consequences of the world's justice system. But there was no justice for the Irish in the 1840s. There was a hole in the ground filled with lime, or there was a coffin ship, and if you were lucky to make it to the United States, you were lucky. Otherwise you were dumped at sea as another unrecorded victim of bad management and bad politics. Because for me, while the potato blight was caused by nature, the Irish famine was caused by politicians, and particularly those in Westminster, who showed absolutely no regard for and no compassion, no empathy, no sympathy for the Irish. We were just merely chattels to be removed off of the Irish landscape to make way for the landlord's cattle. And that is the reality. Because in the 1840s, prior to the arrival of the famine, the British had on several occasions tried everything in their power to, in many ways, get us to behave as a culture. They banned our language, they banned our sports, they banned us attending our gatherings on Sunday to celebrate our individual religions. And it wasn't just Catholicism. They did everything in their power to try and make sure that they would in some ways de-Irish Ireland. And they had failed. But ultimately this potato blight came, and it did something for the British that they thought that they would never ever be able to do. It silenced fields and valleys, it eradicated communities, it abolished in many cases our culture, it wiped us out, and it took us for many, many generations to be able to recover. So something that was in many ways an environmental issue in the arrival of the potato blight from continental Europe, in many ways became something that the British thought that they would never ever be able to lay their hands on. Finally something to get rid of the Irish. And it did. It got rid of over 2 million of us in a 4 to 5 year period, which in today's world is something, as I say, that those that would have perpetrated it would have been brought before The Hague to answer for their consequences. But in the Irish case, that wasn't to be the case, because you had people like Charles Trevelyan, And Charles Trevelyan is immortalised in, of course, you know, the song The Fields of Athenry. But he was some detail, this fella. I mean, what he did in Ireland was absolutely unbelievable. And he had an attitude that, and he said this in Parliament, because for his troubles in the way in which he had administered so-called relief in Ireland, for his troubles, the Whig government, which had decided to leave us to laissez-faire politics, and the market was supposed to intervene to save 1 million people. For his troubles, Charles Trevelyan got a knighthood. 1 million people dead and 1 million people forced to leave. And this will tell you the kind of an attitude that was pervasive in British politics at the time, and something that Daniel O'Connell asked people to reflect on as he told them in his last speech before he tried to make that famous pilgrimage to Rome, that what Britain was doing was not only setting Ireland on a course for huge devastation, but as well as that was setting the seeds for a revolutionary period, that my grandfather would talk about his grandparents' memories of what had happened in the 1840s. And, you know, we were supposedly part of a United Kingdom at the time, but the reality was that we weren't. We weren't even second-class citizens. We were third or fourth-class citizens in a so-called United Kingdom. Because if this had happened in the Cotswolds or in the Shires, or if it happened in London or Birmingham or anywhere else, the Russell government at the time, the Whig government, and I suppose one good thing is that the Whigs finally were wiped out by the political establishment in Britain as well, so there did come some karma for them, but only for the intervention of a small number of people, the situation would have been worse. Because the Whigs as well decided that they were going to tax relief in Ireland. So any benevolent landlord, any landlord who was going to try and do something for the Irish was going to have to pay for it. And as a result, a lot of them went bankrupt, and as a result, a lot of them, the benevolent ones, couldn't manage to be able to look after us because there was to be no direct financial intervention from London. Instead, we were just to be left to our own devices. And like the quotes at the time are very stark. And Trevelyan, in one of his quotes, he said, "The great evil we have to contend with is not the physical evil of the famine, but it is the moral evil of the people." And of course he was referring there to the big families that we all came from, myself one of them. And this was the attitude that was pervasive in Ireland at the time. And this was the attitude that ultimately led the seeds for a number of different failed uprisings between the 1840s and ultimately when Irish elected members of Parliament decided in 1919, after the 1918 election, that they were no longer going to sit in a foreign parliament, but that they were going to sit in their own parliament and call it Dáil Éireann, and it began the road to Irish independence, which we ultimately obtained in 1922. So while there has been an attempt in some quarters to issue a statement in relation to Britain's role in the Irish famine, it has never properly been acknowledged by that country. And it needs to be, because we all still carry the scars of it. Everywhere you turn on the island of Ireland, there is a reminder of what happened in that period of our history. Where I come from myself, there's now a community hospital, St. Itas Community Hospital in Newcastle West. It was formerly the workhouse. It became then a place for women who found themselves pregnant outside marriage. But it was built initially by the British as a place to put people who were literally starving in their droves. And behind it was I wouldn't call it a grave as much as a hole in the ground, where those who were unfortunate enough to die were literally dragged in carts and dumped there. They got no headstone, they got no Christian burial, they got no record entry into any logbook. They simply didn't exist. And the state at the time, the imperial state at the time, the state that was in itself so preoccupied with an industrial revolution, had introduced to the world an industrial methodology of getting rid of people that it didn't want. And that, for me, is something that I think needs to be responded to, and it needs to be reflected on. Because if it happened today, the United Nations and all of its agencies would be calling it a genocide. And what happened in Ireland in the 1840s is no different, to be perfectly honest about it. And it still stands, in my estimation, in my book, as a kind of a half-baked follower of history, particularly of 19th century history in Europe and in Ireland, of one of the greatest travesties and one of the greatest tragedies and one of the greatest wrongs that was ever committed in this world for which the world has never fully recognised the impact of it. Because all of you here are the impact of it. You're the impact of it by virtue of the fact that your people, my people, were literally washed up, bedraggled, wretched, full of disease, starved if they managed to get to somewhere like Grosse Ile in the St. Lawrence Estuary, just up the road, or if they managed to get to New York and Philadelphia, and then to face the journey out here. How they managed to do it was something that absolutely is something that I cannot be able to comprehend it. And America at the time was the last place of hope for the Irish. And it provided us with an awful lot of hope. And no wonder it did. In 1776, when America finally struck for independence from the same colonial yoke that we had to wait another 150 odd years to get out from under in 1922, the Irish played a huge role in your quest for independence. Not only were they there with Washington and Yorktown and in the Continental Army and everything like that, but 3 of the signatories of the Proclamation of Independence were born on the island of Ireland, and many more had direct lineage to it. Up until 1900, almost every president of the United States had a direct family connection to the island of Ireland, north and south. And the one thing that they all had in common, they might have had different religions of Presbyterianism or Episcopalism or Catholicism or whatever, but the one thing that they all had in common was immigration. Immigration from a country that had been failed by a colonial administration to allow people to be able to build a life for themselves in Ireland. And that's why today, that whether it is in relation to Jackson, or Kennedy, or Buchanan, or Jefferson, or any of the great American presidents, right up to Nixon and Carter and Reagan and Biden, they all had one thing in common. Somebody belonged to them, came from the island of Ireland. And in many cases, they came here as a direct result of the famine. Our population was obliterated. Obliterated. And in any other country in the world would be standing on today and say, how have you managed to make yourself the country that you have when everything was done to absolutely excoriate your identity, make your language illegal, make your creed illegal, make the assembly of people on a Sunday morning to go to Mass and celebrate the Eucharist a crime for which you would be locked up and deported probably to Australia. These people showed a lack of compassion, the likes of which the world has never seen, and please God, will never see again. And luckily for the Irish, and luckily for the British, the Irish are bigger people when it comes to this. Because today the relationship between Britain and Ireland is never been better. And that has been led in no small way due to the adult type approach that has been taken by successive Irish governments and leaders of Ireland to make sure that the relationship is better. And yes, while there is an element to, in many cases, gloss over what happened in the 1840s, for me, that's something that we cannot do and that we must not do. The people who were dragged from the workhouses like Newcastle West and dumped in a hole full of lime without any headstone, without any mark anywhere, deserve something better. They deserve monuments like this. They deserve to be immortalised in poetry and song and dance. And they also deserve a proper apology. They don't deserve a civil service written statement to say that there was great difficulties in the 1840s. As I said at the start, the blight was brought to Ireland by the environment, but the famine was brought to Ireland by a government. And that is the reality. And nothing will change my view in that. The Cork University Press have done a magnificent amount of work with regard to the Atlas of the Great Irish Famine. And if you haven't seen it, you should get it. Because it details townland by townland just how Ireland was absolutely failed by a political class that wanted nothing more but to get rid of us. And every single page that you turn shows the level of impact that the famine had, not just for 4 or 5 years, but for 4 or 5 generations. Since the last census, the population of the island of Ireland has only recovered to pre-famine levels. 200 years it has taken us to get back to where we were in 1847. If anybody believes that there's any other country out there that has experienced that level of neglect and that level of absolute atrociousness, I would love to see it. Because I know that it doesn't exist. Not even in the great wars did people suffer to the extent that the Irish were forced to suffer from. As I said a while ago, they wanted to get rid of us out of the fields and valleys and the land of Ireland to make room for cattle. And at a time of its peak in 1847, when most of the people died in Ireland, Ireland was a net exporter of thousands of tons of grain. Because of British government policy, it made sure that the grain was going to be exported for the landlord class and that the Irish were going to starve. The Corn Laws made sure that that was not going to change, and instead they brought in Mickey Mouse elements of congested works and things like that to get starving people to try and build roads and other key pieces of infrastructure. They added insult to injury to the Irish, and they continue to do so right up until Ireland finally struck for its independence. I'm a constitutional Irish Republican. I believe that sovereignty is derived from the people, not from a jewel on your head and not from a birthright, but from the ballot box. And this is something that is deep, runs in my veins, because as the people that came here experienced a terrible reality, but the people that survived at home also experienced a terrible reality. And they never spoke about it. They never spoke about it to their children or their grandchildren because they didn't want to. They didn't want to because they didn't hope. They hoped that they would never ever again see anything of the likes of this. And for many cases, the Bailidis, as they call it, Asquelga, that kind of oral and vocabulary and a kind of oral folklore died out. But in many cases it didn't. And in many cases, grandparents told their children exactly what they had seen and what they had suffered. And of course we know then as well the census records brought to bear the exact scale of what had been happening in Ireland. An industrial scale wipeout of people, ordinary innocent people who for nothing else other than being poor were sanctioned to death by an uncaring and uninterested British government. And to me today this is really important. I want to thank the organisers, and this monument in many ways is a stark reminder to all of us of the journey that we have walked. Whether you come to Gaelic Park to play a hurling match or whether you come here on pilgrimage to this monument, the reality is that you're walking in the footsteps of those who walked before you a very difficult journey to make a life for themselves and their children that would be somehow better than the misery that they were left with on the island of Ireland. To everybody that has been involved in the commemoration, from my own department and for the local community here, I thank you sincerely, not just on my own behalf and on behalf of the Government of Ireland, but on behalf of all those who never made the journey, on behalf of all of those for whom this never became a reality, those that were dragged out of workhouses or those that died like dogs on the side of the road, in many cases the stench becoming so overpowering that somebody would eventually do something with the lying corpses that lay everywhere, strewn everywhere across the so-called United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This is something that I think the Irish will never forget. It is in our DNA. It runs deep. And while there is a new relationship now between us and our nearest neighbour, for me, this is unfinished business. This is unfinished business for our families and for everybody who went before us. The Irish diaspora didn't just happen. It didn't just happen that people went to New Zealand and Australia and the United States and Canada. They went there because they were forced to go there. They went there because they were literally thrown out of their own country by people who couldn't give a damn about them. So when St. Patrick's Day comes around and we turn rivers and everything green and we all wear in green and we have paddywhackery coming out of our elbows, it looks great and we have great crack. But there is a seminal and a very stark message behind it. We are all survivors of the greatest atrocity that was ever committed by a government on any group of innocent people ever. And I really hold strong to that view. And while I hold strong to that view, I hope that you do too. And I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Good meal, Mahagav.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those eloquent words. We're now going to have a short cultural programme. First, the Chicago Irish Singers will perform the City of Chicago. Thank you. Thank you to the Chicago singers for Chicago Irish singers for a wonderful rendition of the city of Chicago. I'd now like to call on Mary O'Sullivan to read Quarantine by the Irish poet Van Boland.
Thank you, Brian. Quarantine by Evan Boland. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year, of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking, north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead. Of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death, together, in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved.
Thank you, Mary. I'd now like to call on Jonathan Harmoning to play the Piper's Lament. Thank you. Thank you. I'd now like to invite the Minister to lay a first wreath on behalf of the government and people of Ireland. Now, Vice President Flynn, please. and now Bill O'Sullivan on behalf of Chicago Gaelic Park. We will now have a minute's silence. I now invite the Chicago Irish Singers to perform the national anthems.
again, thanks everyone for attending. I'd like to invite you all in for the Mass celebrated by Father Brankin, followed by breakfast. And I'd like to thank the Irish government for buying everybody breakfast.